Hey there, it's Dr. Peevler again, and we're going to do another episode of the Nurse and the Doc Roundtable. I've got my colleague here, Jordan, here to help ask some questions and further the discussion. We discussed during these roundtables integrative medicine, functional medicine, quantum biology, and quantum medicine, and anything in between. So, Jordan, do you want to start off by, I don't know, introducing yourself?
Yeah. Again, I'm Jordan. I'm a RN here and interested in all things from the cutting edge of science like quantum biology, mitochondrial heteroplasmy, and I think we could say we're both biohackers at that.
Yes, I think that I can claim that title of biohacker extraordinaire. All right, you ready to get into it?
Yeah. So we're talking today about mitochondrial heteroplasmy, right?
Well, I think we're currently in like a mini series, right? So, the overarching principle is mitochondrial redox. And I'm trying to tell the story kind of in a very stepwise approach, going from what are mitochondria to what do mitochondria do to what's inside mitochondria and how do they get damaged and how does that damage then lead to disease. And so right now we're in that mini series of mitochondrial heteroplasmy. I've put out 3 videos. I think there'll probably be a total of 5 looking at the materials that I have. And then of course these roundtables can be on mitochondrial heteroplasmy, the current like kind of mini series we're in, or really anything that comes to mind. And I think we talked about in the first one, ultimately, I think we'd like to have the audience ask questions in the comments throughout the week, and then we can even address some of those either like really great questions or recurring questions that seem to be maybe stumping several people so that we can address those things in the best way we can.
Yeah. If you guys have a question, leave it down below in the comments and
Yeah.
try. So I remember one of the recurring themes was the mitochondrial heteroplasmy varies per sites in our body or systems. Can that spread? Like, so if I have pretty bad mitochondrial heteroplasmy, say in my gut, can that spread systemically to maybe like the brain, immune system?
Yeah. So, you know, the way that would be possible and very likely happens is because when you have heteroplasmy, those mitochondrial genes that encode for proper mitochondrial function, including the actual electron transport chain, right? And that's where the magic is happening. That's where the majority of the redox is happening inside your body, right? And so when you have damage to that system, you end up putting off a bunch of extra reactive oxygen and reactive nitrogen species. And that in and of itself can do local damage in the cell that it's happening in, but also as those cells can get destroyed, it can leak, reactive oxygen species to the local environment and potentially get carried into the bloodstream. And that's kind of like I believe what Dr. Jack Cruz is talking about when he talks about uh, oxidized plasma, like that as if the plasma of your bloodstream is actually oxidized. And so, yes, I believe that it's carried through the bloodstream and the local environment. And as we talk more about redox, we're going to see that these redox reactions can have like a runaway effect where like one molecule that's got a reactive oxygen species or reactive nitrogen species can then cause like a chain reaction of those kind of reactions to corresponding proteins and lipids in the local area, and that kind of like can run away with itself. So I do believe it would be affecting the local area and the systemic circulation and the systemic systems as a whole via kind of like a chain reaction of reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species that are being carried throughout the body. But then in addition to that, when you have damage to mitochondria, either the mitochondrial DNA or cytochrome C gets can set off the inflammasome, which then signals to the nucleus to put off a bunch of inflammatory markers, right? And the innate immune system is is very like a shotgun. You know what I mean? Like it's just like it starts putting out the inflammatory markers, and those are carried in the bloodstream to the local area as well. And that can also cause downstream damage, right? So yes, it can affect other systems. It's just that it's going to be the local area that's going to be the most affected by those things. But yes, there will be a ripple or shockwave effect through the entire system.
Hmm. Okay. So it kind of sounds then, can we use antioxidants to slow down this shockwave effect or maybe prevent it from even happening?
Well, what I would like to say first before I address that is that we're going to be talking in detail about mitochondrial redox. We're going to be talking about how reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species form and what they even are. Like, what are the species we're talking about? Superoxide, like different things, right? Peroxynitrate, et cetera. We're going to be talking about these specific reactive oxygen and reactive nitrogen species in detail, and then like what systems our body has to protect against that, right? To maintain redox homeostasis. But I don't mind talking about it a little bit here. I just think it may be a little bit advanced for this part of where we are in the series. But in general, yes, there are exogenous antioxidants that we can take in from food, and there are endogenous antioxidants systems that we have, right? Like I'm sure most people have heard about, like for example, the glutathione system, but there's also like the superoxide dismutase, there's also catalase, there's also the pyridoxins, the thioredoxins. There's many systems that our body has that we're going to be going into in great detail about how that happens. And then there's also kind of like master regulators of those systems, right? So melatonin is a direct antioxidant, but it also acts genetically, through the DNA of the nucleus to signal to actually create more antioxidant systems, and the same with vitamin D. So yes, there are things to do to mitigate, and that's kind of what the entire premise of this mitochondrial redox is about. It's about understanding the problem at hand and how the problem gets created, but it's also about how the body can mitigate that damage and create a balance and redox homeostasis. And I'd also like to say that, and I'll talk about this at length, when we actually get deeper into the mitochondrial redox portion, but not all reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species are actually bad. They're actually used as signaling. So
Oh,
there's really neat graphs that I'll show later, but it's basically like a graph that goes up like this. And it's like, okay, at this level, you're actually not having any signaling happening at all. So then there's a sweet spot where there's like redox happening, where there's signaling going on, where there's biochemistry and physiology happening, right? And then there's going to be a limit to where there's too much redox damage, right? There's oxidative damage that's happening, and that causes the imbalance and the problems that we don't want, right? So it is a balance, and I'll have a lot of hopefully ways of narrating and explaining that in the coming weeks and months, and to show how that is important.
hmm. And one example that, kind of like really comes to mind and I want to particularly ask about is, given the important role of the eye for regulating the circadian rhythm and circadian rhythm being related to all sorts of disease in our modern day, um, how does that one specifically, like poor eye mitochondria, affect our whole body and whole system?
Yeah, it's a great question, man. I think I have a pretty good grasp on this. I can't say that I'm at like a Dr. Jack Cruz level, like understanding neuroanatomy and neurobiology, but I'll take a stab at it at least. So the eye in particular is of great importance, because that's where the light cycle, light through the retina and hitting the neuropsin, melanopsin receptors in the back, the back and the front of the eye, then communicate with the brain, to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which then has many downstream effects on the peripheral clocks and the peripheral clock genes, right? And so when you damage, the eye, and you don't have the ability to have those signals coming in, it's kind of like they talk a lot about in particular on Jack's, forums a lot about cataracts and cataract surgery, and doing eye surgery for corrective eye surgery, and how that has very likely effects on the ability to utilize the eye physiology like you're supposed to, right? So either damaging neuropsin on the cornea of the eye, or damaging the ability to collect UV to the retina of the eye, right? And how those lights frequencies in particular are important to signaling, the non-visual photoreceptors, and how that affects physiology, right? So there's a lot of complex, neurochemistry going on between dopamine, between, melatonin, and between also between hormones like POMC, and how POMC is a pro-opiomelanocortin, and that pro-opiomelanocortin, for example, has several downstream hormones that affect several different aspects of our health, right? So it's very hard to even quantify how damaging it would be if you were to damage the eye. Now we know that melanopsin is in the skin and pretty much everywhere. So there's other ways of getting those signals in, but the main signal is through the eye. So I hope that does that answer the question, or did I dance around it, or how do you think that, does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gives a pretty good idea that we really want to protect our eyes as much as possible.
Yeah.
And maybe out of our whole system, the eyes mitochondria could
Yeah,
be.
man. There's no question, and when you have, for example, um, in the upcoming, well, actually, take it back. It was actually the last video we talked about the RPE, the retinal pigmentum epithelium,
Uh-huh.
and having damage there, and having increased mitochondrial heteroplasmy there in particular. There's a it's a very important, to protect the retina, and it seems like many things can damage that system. It's, how do I say it? There are very diverse ways of creating oxidative stress, and that picture that was in that slide, showing the central problem being ROS, then leading to downstream mutations and downstream bioenergetic decline and mitochondrial dysfunction, which ultimately leads to, AMD, right? Or macular degeneration, and then ultimately blindness, right? So, AMD is worried about the blindness aspect of it and not being able to see, which would be horrible, right? But what's not being said, at least in that paper, is it's also damaging these non-visual photoreceptors and messing up signaling for the circadian oscillators. And, so the circadian rhythm, I'll have a very large component of this entire mitochondrial series will be on circadian rhythms and how critically important they are. You know what I mean? And when we mess those up, you're going to have a really uphill battle, trying to fix yourself.
Wow. So essentially, the eye's mitochondria are probably one of the most important in our whole body because it has such potential for systemic effects. And if through the eyes, where we collect a lot of our natural sunlight to create melatonin, and melatonin's like maybe like the strongest molecule to repair heteroplasmy, then
It's
yeah,
definitely
maybe.
one of the most important molecules in the body. There's no question. The more I study about mitochondria, and the more I study about melatonin is unbelievable. It is unbelievable what it can do and what it's responsible for. And I think that most of us, even healthcare professionals, think melatonin only has to do with like the induction of sleep, and there's nothing else that it does, right? And that couldn't be further from the truth.
So could we say wearing blue light glasses is a way to prevent that eye mitochondrial damage?
I mean, it definitely is a start, right? I mean, definitely like being outside in natural light is a much better, a much better strategy, like being away from artificial, LED, lights, and and that garbage light that is damaging to yourself is probably the number one strategy, is just completely get away from man-made light. But if you're like most people who are stuck in a job, under fluorescent lighting, under LED lighting, looking at an LED screen all day for your job, like, yes, I mean, what else can you do besides mitigate it like that through using blue blocking lenses? And, as you know, blue blocking lenses are not blue blocking lenses are not blue blocking lenses, right? Like there are a wide variety of specs for those blue blocking lenses. Some of the companies don't even like tell you what frequencies are blocked. You know what I mean? Like in particular, the ones that I'm wearing, and I love my optometrist. He's a good friend of mine. But these don't have a spec. They block 38% of blue light, quote unquote, but they don't actually have a spec, right? It doesn't say what frequencies. Whereas, for example, the lenses you're wearing, the blue techs, I suspect they have a frequency that they tell
Yeah.
you what frequencies. My raw
Wow.
optics that are prescription, both the day and night lenses tell you exactly what frequencies are being blocked and at what percent, So it's kind of like fish oil, like I'm getting omega-3s in my Walmart fish oil, but you don't realize you're getting absolutely nothing in those fish oil tablets, but you think you're doing good. And it's not that you're, bad or anything like that. It's just that they prey on the consumer not having the knowledge to actually scrutinize the product. So you do have to know, what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, then you need to ask help, about how to figure out what it would be a good option for you to block blue light.
Wow. And could we say that, some mitochondria are harder to fix than others? Like maybe it's a lot harder to fix neuron mitochondria compared to, let's say, muscle, bone, or gut mitochondria.
That's a great question, Jordan. I don't know the answer to that, man. I don't, honest to God, know the answer to that. I mean, I think that for the most part, we know that, some tissues heal faster than other tissues. There's no question.
That's
Um,
why I,
I think that some tissues are more metabolically active than others, obviously. And, I think in particular, like in regards to, we'll talk about this during the mitochondrial dynamics, that's like after mitochondrial heteroplasmy, the next mini series will be mitochondrial dynamics. A lot of the literature for example, mitochondrial biogenesis, a lot of it has to do with like muscle, you know what I mean? And does that generalize, throughout the entire body, for those stimuli and signals, and it's kind of unclear, I think it's likely that it does generalize, for the entire body, because, for example, like exercise, like we know that it improves brain health, we know it improves vessel health, we know it improves heart health, et cetera, right? And so you have to imagine that if exercise is improving, mitophagy and mitochondrial biogenesis and fission and fusion reactions and improving like mitochondrial crystal formation and networking and so on and so forth, mitochondrial supercomplex formation, you have to imagine that it would be generalized because it actually does have a whole system effect, you know. But it's just hard to do those studies because when they do those studies on those kind of like processes that are happening because of exercise, what are they doing biopsies on? They're doing biopsies on muscle. They're not doing brain biopsies, right? They're doing muscle biopsies. So it's hard to know whether it generalizes or not, but you have to somewhat in some way assume, that it probably is systemic.
hmm, right. And what got me to think about that is that, we have limited amount of neurons and there is like neurogenesis, but as far as I know, it's limited relative to, other cells in our body that don't have a limit or are proliferate a lot more.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it makes a lot of sense too. It's just that I think that it's fairly well known that the two most metabolically active organs are your heart and your brain, right? And that means that they're going to have the majority of the AT or the mitochondrial density in those organs in particular are the highest, right? So those are the things that are going to be the most susceptible to mitochondrial illnesses, at least overtly clinically, and that could be something as simple as like fatigue and brain fog, or it could be something as profound as neurodegeneration, like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and dementia, right? So there is a continuum of that. But I think that when you start to feel brain fog, when you start to feel like you're not quite as focused as you normally would be, um, you know that the mitochondria in the brain is likely being affected, somehow.
So sometimes I've heard this, I think we've all heard it, that, if you're having brain fog or issues focusing or what else, something related, it could be coming from the gut, it could be coming from other areas of the body, but can we say that it's more likely that there's problems with the mitochondria in that area in your brain?
Well, it's gonna be easier to make this point, man, like when you start to connect the dots, right? So if you can understand that mitochondria can get damaged by many different stimuluses, right? But ultimately it kind of boils down to oxidative stress and inflammation being the two main drivers, right?
Hmm.
You could also say insulin resistance and high blood glucose levels and things like that, right? But that ultimately manifests via inflammation and oxidative stress. And if you can understand that oxidative stress and inflammation can come from your gut, it can come from it can come from many different sources, And as a matter of fact, the gut is a very good source of that, because if you're eating garbage inflammatory food, if you have dysbiosis and those are and your immune system is putting off inflammatory cytokines, et cetera, like that's going to affect systemically your the oxidative stress levels and also the inflammation levels in your body, right? And those are going to have a double whammy, a 1-2 punch on mitochondria everywhere, but you're going to feel it in your brain, right? In addition to
Wow.
that, the gut is intrinsically tied to the autonomic nervous system. And so there's also the kind of the nervous system component, directly affecting the brain that way too, the brain gut axis, et cetera. So yes, I do believe that those things definitely affect the mitochondria in your brain, um, through several different mechanisms.
And is there any way to reverse heteroplasmy?
So I believe that is true, that you can reverse heteroplasmy. If I didn't believe you could reverse heteroplasmy, I don't think I'd even talk about it. I wouldn't even do this series because I'm like, well, you're screwed. It's over.
I hope. Yeah.
Um, you know, I, I think we're going to talk about these concepts in detail, in the upcoming kind of mini series. In particular, I think an important piece of this story will be the mitochondrial dynamics. And just before obviously we won't go deep into mitochondrial dynamics and what they are, but it's basically how the mitochondria regenerate themselves and repair themselves, right? So it's really a cool process how the mitochondria will separate one damaged part from itself, and then it'll divide, through uh, mitochondrial fusion. And then that damaged part of the mitochondrial then will go through mitophagy, which is the recycling of that mitochondria, and it's like continually clearing itself out from damage. And so if you have improper, mitochondrial dynamics, and that can include fission, fusion, mitophagy, and mitochondrial biogenesis. And if you don't have those processes working like they're supposed to be working, then you will have really no way to improve mitochondrial heteroplasmy, right? Because you're just going to continue to accumulate damage without the ability to repair it. But it's those processes in particular, those four processes that are critically important. And we're going to talk about what stimulates those processes to work to properly function, so that you can have the best chance of improving your mitochondrial heteroplasmy, right? The other end of that coin is reducing mitochondrial DNA damage and mitochondrial protein damage, right? By reducing the inflammation and the oxidative stress. And there's going to be a lot of detail into, mitochondrial redox and the systems you have in place to prevent damage, or mitigate damage before it becomes to a point where you need to actually recycle the entire mitochondria, and our bodies have eloquent systems to do that, and if there's one thing I've learned, throughout this process, is like, you don't really want to be taking exogenous antioxidant supplements. You know what I mean? You don't want to be taking boatloads of vitamin A and vitamin E and vitamin C and and these even like designer antioxidants, like boatloads of astaxanthin or boatloads of like things. Now, are those things found in foods that are in the right ratios and that can help you? Yes. But I think that what I've realized is probably the more important thing, and we'll talk about it in detail, is activating your endogenous antioxidant systems and letting the body figure out what needs to be kept in check, right? Like, because there is something called reductive stress, basically. It's the opposite of oxidative stress. It's basically where you have so much antioxidants in your system because you're taking artificial, or exogenous antioxidants, that you don't have enough reactive oxygen and reactive nitrogen species to actually signal. And those signals are important for many cellular processes, including gene signaling. So there is a balancing act to this thing. And that's why, it's not good to just, throw the baby out with the bathwater and realize that not all oxidation and reduction reactions are bad. As a matter of fact, that you need those reactions in order to function properly. And so by clamping them down and just taking boatloads of, antioxidant pills, you're probably doing yourself more harm than you are doing good.
Got it. All right. I don't know if we hit a time mark for this episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we probably went over time than what we normally would expect, but it was a good conversation. I mean, do you have any other last minute questions, or
Uh,
did we hit them
no,
all?
I think so. Yeah.
Good.
I look forward to, I think, this episode definitely opened our minds, definitely did mine, for many more questions in the next episode on maybe practical applications that we can make, and so many other questions on mitochondrial heteroplasm.
Cool, man. And I do believe that the next the mini series of the mitochondrial dynamics will also expand the conversation quite a bit further, because we're seeing how the DNA gets damaged, and we're seeing how the DNA damage, causes systemic disease. But then we start talking about how the mitochondria repair themselves and regenerate themselves, and those are important tidbits to know about, so you can understand that the body can truly heal itself, and we have to just get out of the way a lot of the times.
And I'll emphasize again, if you guys in the audience do have any questions, leave them down below, and we'll try to get to those next episode if possible.
Absolutely. If you have questions, if something we said doesn't make any sense at all, or isn't congruent with what you've read in the literature, like, I'd be happy to have the discussion with you, and try to clear that up.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, Jordan, it's good seeing you as always, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, man. Likewise to you.
All right. See you. Bye-bye.